One, I got it today.
Beautiful.
Okay, Anna.
Hi, everybody. Anna from ForSpace here. Welcome back to the second episode in a series of conversations dedicated to exploring what's involved in co-creating a next-gen quartier. Today's focus is on urban biodiversity and well-being. Our three panelists will be introduced in turn by our moderator, Michael Bossert. But before we begin with an introduction from Dr. Ursula Eker, I just want to encourage you, the webinar and the Facebook audiences, to join in the conversation via the Q&A option. We are very grateful that you chose to spend this time with us here today, and very thankful to our panelists and to Dr. Eker for what's sure to be a lively discussion. Have fun, and over to you, Ursula.
Thanks, Anna, and welcome everybody to the second round of talks that the CERC, the Canada Excellence Research Chair for Smart, Sustainable and Resilient Cities organizes. We'll have this series ongoing for quite a while, although it looks likely that we're let out soon again. I think we're still going to work with this kind of virtual conferences for a while. In a way, it's also quite a sustainable way of talking to each other without moving around and polluting the air. So today we talk about biodiversity, and that's in the frame of a larger program on next generation cities, where we take a quite broad and integrated approach to look at cities and how they could transform towards a more sustainable, zero carbon future. So my background is physics, so I look at the energy side of cities, how building efficiency could be improved, how renewables could be brought in, how the transport sector could be more sustainable. And all this is quite related to how we see cities of the future. They should be more efficient and they should be cleaner, have less fossil fuel consumption, but at the same time, they need to be livable. We and many more, and in fact, the majority of people already live in cities, and it's obviously not just about technology. We are citizens, we walk and move and meet in cities, and a major factor of that setting is that we have spaces, public spaces that are enjoyable to be in, to communicate, to meet, and biodiversity plays a large role in that context. It's not just the surrounding forest, where again we would need to have cars to drive to them, but we think it's crucial to have green spaces inside the city, not just because it makes the air cleaner, but also because it creates the spaces that we need to relax, to be healthy, to go running and meet other people. So urban biodiversity has a lot of functions in a city. It's sometimes we now talk about ecosystem services as if they were meant to serve us humans. I mean, I think we have a lot of things to discuss here. I mean, what green space means, whether plants and animals should have a life of their own and not just in our reflection. And I think the nice thing about the CERC and Next Generation Cities Institute and the 5 young cluster hire professors is that we look at it in a very broad sense. And we definitely want to get away from this pure technological focus and see how all the other aspects of life, the universe and everything fit together. So I'm very happy to have here panelists in the discussion today that come from different backgrounds. So we have a sort of real proper biologist amongst them. Kali is part of the city cluster, the CERC city cluster, and she's a specialist on what urban biodiversity can do for us, how it works in the city. Jochen Jäger from geography has worked for many years on urban sprawl, so he will give some interesting insights of what green means on the city outskirts, but maybe also in the city centers. And I won't give away the name of his talk. I mean, it's about Zen, amongst others, so you can look forward to it. And then third, we have Rebecca Tittler here in the discussion. and she will reflect on the importance of biodiversity in urban settings. So we focus on the city, but we will look at the role of urban biodiversity in dense city centers, and I think we are all fully aware that this is more important than ever to have green space close to our homes. With that, I would like to give the word to Michael Bossert, who will moderate this afternoon session. Thank you for joining.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot, Ursula, for this introduction. And thanks a lot to our fantastic panelists who are willing to speak today with this very fantastic weather outside and where biodiversity would be nice to touch outside as well, that you took the time and enlighten us, give us some great insights. And I would like to quickly introduce Carly Sitter. Ursula mentioned already, she's one of the cluster hires. And she's an urban ecologist and assistant professor in the Department of Biology and as well a member of the Loyola Sustainable Research Center. She studies how we can manage green spaces in and around our cities to provide benefits to people while also conserving biodiversity. So the floor is yours.
Oh, forgetting to unmute myself. Thank you, Michael. I'm just gonna share my screen here. And okay, are you seeing my slides? Perfect. All right, so I am going to talk about why cities need biodiversity and now more than ever. So reflecting a little bit on our current situation. As Michael mentioned, I'm a relatively new professor here at Concordia in the biology department, but I've been fascinated by urban nature for a really long time. Today, I'm going to give a general overview of why I think, oh, you're seeing my presenter's view. Oh dear, okay. We're gonna try this again. I'm probably sharing my wrong screen. Let's see. Okay, I think I cannot share my second screen. I can only share my first desktop.
What I did was to mirror the images so that you have both.
Yeah, I think I can do that. Let me just try that here and share this one and share.
No, it's the same again.
I know I have to switch my.
I think you can swap displays.
I can, yes, maybe.
There's a button, swap displays left.
Yeah, it's being covered by my Zoom budding. Beautiful. Okay, are you seeing the right one now? All right.
That's
technical
perfect.
difficulties.
Thank you,
Okay.
Carly. The kind of technical difficulties that make all of this fun. It's all good.
Okay. Well, thank you for warning me there. Okay, so we are, yes, so we are, I'm gonna give an overview here of why I think we should care about urban biodiversity, how we benefit from nature close to home, and I'll end with some lessons that I think we can learn from the current situation for how to build better cities. So this is going to be pretty general to start off our panel, and my colleagues will get into a little bit more specifics as we go. But first, to get everybody on the same page, when scientists talk about biodiversity, we're essentially talking about all of the variability, all of the life on Earth. And so I want you to just pause for a minute and picture, what do you think about when I say biodiversity? And I'll give you a minute to picture that. I think for many of you, maybe your mind went to places like this, our really species-rich parts of the world, maybe the tropics, maybe somewhere you would like to go if we weren't all, stuck in our homes right now. And you're certainly not wrong. These are really biodiverse parts of the world. And so with all of these biodiverse areas, why would a biologist, like me, study urban biodiversity? when there are so many other, wild and wonderful places? And the reason that I study urban biodiversity is because we live in an increasingly urban world. More than half of the world's people, like Ursula mentioned, now live in cities. So more people live in a city than live outside one. And these cities are expanding really quickly, which Jochen can speak to, talking about sprawl. And that means that cities are actually the places where most people interact with nature most often. And this fact, the fact that cities are where most of us interact with nature, kind of underlies one of the really big reasons that I think we should care about biodiversity where we live. And that's because, put really simply, it gives us an incredible range of benefits. So having other plants and animals in the city with us can keep us happier, healthier, safer. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit more detail. Urban biodiversity also provides us a really important opportunity to understand and to connect with nature. People are really unlikely to protect something that they don't care about. And we generally don't care about things that we don't understand. And so interacting with biodiversity where we live, where we are, can help foster that understanding. And this is something that some scientists call the pigeon paradox. So even just getting to know, a humble pigeon in your city can foster a sense of, environmental stewardship and a caring about nature much more broadly. And our other panelists, again, will talk a little bit more about how you can get to know your urban nature. Now, those last two reasons were really more focused on us, kind of what we are getting or how we are experiencing biodiversity. But there are also all kinds of moral, ethical, faith-based reasons that we might value conserving biodiversity for its own sake. We care about protecting other species, and we can do that in cities. And so there's good evidence that cities can be environments, if we manage them properly, that support lots of different wild bee species, for example. And you can see, yesterday was World Bee Day, so I'm highlighting some bees here. And you can see some really gorgeous examples of species that we have right here in Montreal. This first one, Agapostemon virescens, which is a metallic green sweat bee, was actually recently named Toronto's official bee, which is pretty cool that they have that, right? We also, not every species can live in our backyards. Some species just need more space or less people. But that doesn't mean our actions in cities can't help them. By increasing our trees, our shrubs, our green space in the city, we can reduce barriers to those other species, letting them kind of pass through this area and conserving more species regionally. And Jochen's going to give us a great case study of that connectivity really close to home. So why do we care about urban biodiversity? It makes us happier and healthier. It makes us better environmental stewards. And it's an opportunity to protect other species that are important to us. And I'm going to dig in a little further on this first one, on ecosystem services, which is something that my lab here at Concordia studies. And there's a lot of different names that we could give these. We might call it natural capital, or nature's contributions to people, or nature-based solutions. But really at the heart of it, we're talking about the benefits we receive from ecosystems, from nature around us. Things like food, water purification, flood protection, mental health. And to give just a few examples of these, so first, where do these come from? These come from having diverse green spaces. So we might not think about cities as being somewhere where we have a lot of nature or where we live in an ecosystem, but all of these little bits and pieces and patches of nature in the city are contributing something. And if we want multiple benefits, we need multiple kinds of space. So urban forests, for example, the trees in the city are incredibly important for helping us to cool the air in the summer. So this is work that my lab has done, where as we increase our neighborhood tree cover past a certain point, we get really dramatic decreases in air temperature. This is really important in cities like Montreal that are going to get hotter and hotter in the summer as the climate changes. If you go to Canada's Climate Atlas, which is a really beautiful publication, they have this figure that always is really striking to me, that in the past, when I was a kid, Montreal would have 8 days of the year over 30 degrees Celsius. By the time I retire from my new job at Concordia, we're expecting 50 days of the year over 30 degrees Celsius. And trees can help us adapt to that new reality in our cities. But trees alone are not enough. They don't give us all of these benefits. So urban agriculture, for example, can create ways for us to access fresh or culturally acceptable food. It can provide environmental and nutrition education, and a lot of these other kind of green infrastructure benefits, like absorption of water or support for other species. There's a really wonderful roundtable in The Nature of Cities that talks about urban agriculture and sustainability. And maybe there's a way I can talk to Anna after about sharing some of these links with you so you can go back and do some reading. And this is something that we have a lot of in Montreal. Montreal is known for urban agriculture projects, and you can check those out and explore, what are the urban agriculture initiatives in your area of the city, and what are they doing to create a healthier environment. And finally, urban green spaces keep us healthy, mentally and physically. I think this is something most of us kind of intuitively know, right? We understand being around nature makes us feel better, but we're increasingly seeing more and stronger scientific studies supporting this relationship. And so putting this together, the key point here, oh, perfect. We can share all the links with the audience after. So don't try and jot these notes down. We'll share them with you. Thanks, Anna. So putting this together, what we're really seeing is that, we might think of urban nature as kind of nice to have. Flowers are nice, trees are nice, but it's actually critical to have in our cities. The same way we build and we maintain great infrastructure like roads and bridges and buildings, we need to grow and maintain our green infrastructure. And I think right now, we're really seeing more broad kind of understanding of that. That hasn't always been the case. With everyone kind of staying home, slowing down, people are more compelled than ever to connect with their urban biodiversity. So all of a sudden, everyone is growing a garden. People who have never planted anything in their life are calling garden stores and asking where to start. We're running out of seeds at our common distributors. We see more urban wildlife. And some of you have probably seen articles about, nature is returning or taking over. And that's not quite the story, I think. Really what we're seeing is quieter streets and waters and a slower pace of life is really letting us notice the wildlife that has been living among us all along. We've always been sharing our spaces with species. We're just taking the time to see them now. And finally, urban green spaces are providing our kind of primary source of nature now that we're confined closer to home and haven't been able to travel to larger, provincial or national parks. And this is providing really important kind of mental health benefits and resilience that Rebecca will explore a little further. But maybe most importantly, these are all, great things. People planting gardens, people going to the park, people watching wildlife. But COVID-19 has increased awareness of some of these serious inequities in who has access to green space during this time. And many neighborhoods simply do not have enough space to provide these kind of critical benefits to urban residents. And I think we should use this time of kind of heightened awareness around how important urban biodiversity is to really advocate for greener, more just cities. As Ursula mentioned to start us off, better cities aren't just about better buildings and better technologies. They're also about green space and biodiversity and being livable. And I'm just going to end with this gift that I love of how even in a small space, you can pack so much nature. You don't need to sprawl to do this, but you do need to build your neighborhoods for people and not for cars. And so I am going to end there. I'll turn that off so you're not seeing it over and over, but I will pass the mic back to Michael to, oh, now I've closed my thing, to Michael to moderate. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions now. I'm also happy to take kind of questions after the 3 panels when you've had a broader overview of what we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Carly. This is really great to see, like living in Griffintown here around the Lachine Canal. I see it, everyone needs to go out, like everyone is like around the canal, and it's even partly insane because like you see a little bit of sun and it's crowded there. And I'm wondering how this might fit with COVID-19, but you see that a lot of things need to change. Like it's the COVID-19 makes persons really much more aware of this, and I hope at least that it will change a lot of urban planning in the longer run. Just by the Lachine Canal, I can say some persons told me stories about it was even burning because it was so polluted, and now it's a hotspot. So there are chances, and yeah, I would just like to open the discussion maybe about observations and how you see it in everyday, how this, because I like to link it a bit, the awareness of biodiversity. And I think the COVID-19 can cause here changes, because we should not, you mentioned it as well, forget about climate change. Because like COVID came up and it's here for, let's say, quite a while. But the climate change, you gave the outlook, 2050, 2080. And I think we need to use it and to come up with concepts and to change urban planning and so on. So I would like just to ask our panelists, like, what are your observations? Like, how do you see in your everyday, like, how does it change already? I know from Ursula, she's very often around on the Lachine Canal. What are your observations around?
Yeah, I mean, my observations are that the spaces where there is a bit of green here in downtown Montreal are very, very limited. I mean, that's a problem why spaces like the Lachine Canal are so overcrowded. This and Mont-Royal, because these are the only green spaces. I mean, all around, and including all around Concordia downtown campus, it's just concrete everywhere. There's not even a piece of meadow to sit on. So it's I think we are very far from the picture that we all like to see. And I mean, I think the crisis now, I mean, the move towards changing streets into more pedestrian and cycling areas is a good first move. But I haven't heard anything about using that sort of momentum to, at the same time, maybe dig up some streets and put some grass. So I think that's what we need. I mean, we need much more open and green spaces in the city centers, and I think we are a long way off.
Yes. I think Jochen wanted to comment as well.
Yes, there are some nice initiatives, at least on the plateau area, where they have dug up some of the back streets. Like when they have these blocks, they have these 4 access streets from the main streets, and often they dig up one, get rid of the asphalt, and plant. Yeah, Carly.
Yeah, so that the ruelles, so the Ruelle Vert program, I think, is a wonderful example in Montreal of ways we can integrate more green into these very small spaces. And that's something that is supported through the Eco-Quartiers. And I do hope that, you know, what Ursula was saying about, you know, opening more streets to pedestrians and to cyclists, I hope that empowers people. You know, people realize how nice it is when we can kind of take a little bit of this space back from cars and advocate for more of those changes to stick, to have more walking space and cycling space, permanently after this pandemic.
Yeah, just to add to this, I mean, I think there was just one more comment. I mean, there was this discussion, I heard that there was a discussion on Montreal of copying the Barcelona superblock example. It goes in the direction that you said, Jochen, but not just sort of small backyard streets, but really combining several blocks of buildings and basically closing them off to external traffic, allowing a bit of resident traffic, but then greening up the internal space. And that's it's easy to do in a way. It has been proven in Barcelona that it works well for commerce and everybody. So that could be a very interesting approach to be followed up here in the city.
And there's as well a question from the online audience, which brings it in another dimension, more in the third dimension. What about accessible green roofs? What role would they play in all of this? Maybe I just forward to, I don't know, maybe Carly, yeah?
I can comment on that. Yeah, green roofs. It's interesting. I think every single time I've given a talk, someone has said, but what about green roofs? Something people I think are really fascinated with this idea. And it's kind of magical in a way, right? That we could take a place that is kind of concrete and not used and turn it into a green space without losing our building. And I think there are certainly some benefits there. There are benefits in terms of people just having access to more greenery and being able to see, flowers or to see green. Green roofs are going to give you some of the benefits that a park on the ground would, and not others, right? And so if you want to reduce air temperature or pollution, you'll probably get a little bit of that from a green roof, but not as much as you would from trees, for example. There are some species that might be able to use a green roof and others that won't. So it really depends on your goals. But I think in terms of people's kind of access to nature, that would be providing, another place that people could go. And a green roof is likely better than a concrete roof, right?
Yeah, I think concrete is really an issue in Montreal. There are even parks, so-called parks, which means maybe there's a flower, but the rest is just looking at some of the playgrounds for children. It's fantastic. Even if we think the topic of education, how we should, or it's a possibility to educate children as well as young persons and adults, just with such spaces, and to create more community to learn together. And I think there are huge possibilities in Montreal. It's located fantastic. It's an island, and it's surrounded by water. And what I see, it's more or less still used in a very industrial point of view. There is not now to exaggerate to say why not to use it more like in Amsterdam. Of course, there it was created as well for industry or then manufacturers or something like this, but it has a huge life quality. To go to Venice is a different point, but it's a big potential, and I think it could be. And the third dimension I always appreciate to think about as well, facades and so on. And in another event we can speak maybe about urban farming. Then we are very fast on the roofs, even of industrial buildings. And but these just some thoughts. Any more comments? There's another question as well from Facebook. What about Montreal's underground streams? Can you speak to those in this context? I don't know who might be aware of underground streams.
I can comment briefly. So I am not an aquatic ecologist or biologist. I do know, in general, yeah. So when we say underground streams, in many cities, these streams have been kind of channeled and put underground, so they're not open anymore. And there is now a trend in some cities of what they call daylighting, where we kind of open those back up and we restore them. I don't know about any specific initiatives in Montreal. There may be some going on. It's certainly a challenge. It's an engineering challenge, it's an ecological challenge. But blue space is something that maybe we should talk more about here in in Montreal. I've been using the term green space, and Rebecca, I think, maybe has a comment on how it's not just green space. Blue space is really important as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say on the subject of our underground streams that although they have been buried, they are contributing to our green space, to the biodiversity in our green space, although we may not be very conscious of it. There is an ephemeral stream that runs in the back of my house, and when it's not flooding anybody's basement, it has led to the growth of tree species that we would expect to find near water, surprisingly. So we have willows that grow in the backyard, and we have an ephemeral wetland in the backyard which the ducks come to in the spring and fall when they migrate. So that I think that we tend to push these underground streams to the side and try to ignore them and call them problems because they can flood our basements if we're not bagged properly. But that we should start to see them as well as potentially a positive thing and recognize how much they can contribute to our biodiversity.
Thanks a lot. I think I would just give the word now to Jochen. I think we can later on in an overall discussion bring up more if we heard all three of the panelists speaking. And quickly to introduce, Jochen Jäger is Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment. In addition, he's an affiliated member of the Department of Biology and co-director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. His research areas are around landscape ecology, the quantification and assessment of landscape structure and landscape change, land consumption through urban sprawl, and ecological modeling. The title of his presentation, Ursula was starting quickly to mention it, Zen and the Art of Biodiversity Enhancement in an Urban Context. So, Jochen, the floor is yours, or the screen.
Thank you so much, Michael. I will share my screen here. What presentation view do you see here? Presenter's view or viewer's view?
Oh,
it's all good?
It's all good.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for your kind invitation to present here today. I'm very happy to do so and to be here with you. The title of my presentation is Zen and the Art of Biodiversity Enhancement in an Urban Context. So you probably know what book I'm referring to here. Some of you may know it. It's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It came out almost 50 years ago. And by the way, today, Ascension Day, in Germany is Father's Day. So I think it's very appropriate to have here Robert Pirsig with his son, Chris, on the photo here. So one of the main themes of the book is about how humans relate to life. Two main approaches to life are discussed. The first one is rationality, mostly through analytical thinking and through explaining phenomena by analyzing and understanding their parts. This position is also called reductionism. Second approach, on the other hand, there is an approach that the author calls romantic or qualitative. So this is not very clear in the book, but it's closely related to Zen. So today we would use the terms of being in the moment or mindfulness or awareness of everything around us and in us, not just through analytical thinking. Zen means practice, and it refers to the practice of awareness through meditation rather than thinking. Both approaches have their merits, of course, and the author then tries to combine these two ways of approaching life. Today, we may say these two approaches are complementary in some way, and if they could be combined, this may be called a holistic approach to life in some sense. So here are some examples of things around us that we may or may not, or not yet, be aware of. The seasons. Are you aware of the trees in Montreal? Which ones are in bloom now? Have you perceived that many have leaves now? Have you noticed how the leaves have unfurled? and also awareness of the diversity of life around us, which brings us to our topic today, biodiversity. So if Zen is all about awareness, we can ask, how biodiversity aware are we? Can we improve our diversity awareness? You are probably aware that biodiversity was underrated for some time. When I was a student 30 years ago, biodiversity was greatly underrated in the universities. Some scientists even compared taxonomy to stamp collecting. So that was quite uncaring and quite arrogant. In contrast, though, research in biodiversity in the last 15 years has made amazing progress and amazing discoveries that have truly revolutionized this field. If you are interested in these findings, I can recommend the book by David Quammen to you, The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life, which just came out 2 years ago. And then third, are you aware of your relationship with your environment, your relationship with biodiversity? What relationship do you have with it? How aware are you of it? Is it more in the sense of Umwelt or in the sense of Mitwelt? Umwelt means the environment around you. In contrast, Mitwelt means the world that is existing together with you, like roommates in an apartment. Roommates are your Mitbewohners, not your Umbewohners. So those are German words, of course. Let me explain this a little bit more. So means around in German, Welt, of course, world, whereas Mitwelt means with or together. So the Umwelt is surrounding me, I'm in the center, whereas in the Mitwelt, it's existing along with me, like roommates. They are Mitbewohners, not Umbewohners. Umbewohners would be very strange. And when your relation to nature is that of your Umwelt, you will probably ask, why should I care about it? What is in for me? Is it useful for me? Can I profit from it? And if not, I probably don't care as long as it does not harm me. In contrast, when your relation to nature is that of Mitwelt, you will likely ask, how do we relate to each other? So it's all about relationships, many types of relationships. So it is in both directions, and you would care about both directions. So ecology is actually all about relationships. You may have heard the saying that everything is connected. Well, that's true in general, yes, but how is it connected? And this is what ecologists want to better understand. So let's look at the definition of ecology. Ecology is the study of the interrelationships between organisms and their environments, and to other organisms as well. And yes, there's also human ecology. So what are our relationships? How do we relate to life around us? How do we relate to biodiversity? How biodiversity aware are you? How do you relate to the trees in our street? How do you relate to flowers? How do you relate to birdsong? How do you relate to your garden? How do you relate to insects? Maybe you don't like insects as much, but it would be nice to understand them because they have an important role in the ecosystem. Or think about soils. How do you appreciate soils? And also biodiversity inside of you. For example, how do you relate to the biodiversity that's in your gut? How do you treat it? So this all applies to cities. Let's try that. So a master's student of mine recently applied an analysis of urban sprawl to Montreal and Quebec City. And what does it tell you about the relationship between the inhabitants of a city and biodiversity when a city is expanding like Montreal and Quebec? So my student was able to go back to 1951 using old maps, and the black areas show all the built up areas in Montreal and Quebec. And then in 1971, they had expanded like this. This is 1986, 1996, and 2011. So it is a huge increase. This is called urban sprawl. And if you want to learn more about it in more detail, I invite you to read our paper that's available, came out in 2016. And urban sprawl is referred to as dispersed low-density development, and it has a lot of ecological effects, as Victor Grün already illustrated in the 60s. So it's not a very new topic. It has been going on for a while. So we have all these consequences of urban sprawl, and an important section of these consequences is about flora and fauna. So what does this urban sprawl do to biodiversity? Can those animals simply go elsewhere? What does it say about our relationship to biodiversity? So once when I was a boy, I did ask my father about this. I was wondering what happens to the animals that live there. And by the way, it seems I was not so much concerned about the plants. They would be destroyed, obviously. What my father answered, that they can simply look around and find a new home elsewhere. Today, I know that this is not true. We are continuously destroying their habitats. And there is very little space, very little habitat left where they can go in industrialized landscapes. So as a result, some animals are coming into the cities, some animals that never went to the cities before. And we keep making this problem worse by continuing with urban sprawl. If we don't want to have these increasing issues with, for example, increasing numbers of deer in cities and towns, we need to stop urban sprawl. We need to stop making the problem worse. Therefore, increasing our awareness about how we currently are taking advantage of biodiversity is one important next step. One way to do that is to calculate monetary values of ecosystem services, because some people relate more strongly to dollars than to the organisms that create these ecosystem services. So how can we build an emotional relationship so that we will care more about biodiversity? Montreal has a charter for the protection of Montreal's green spaces and natural environments, and it talks about urban sprawl. For example, it is resolved that the Montreal agglomeration put an immediate stop to all urban sprawl on the island of Montreal. However, it's an unofficial document. It was put forward as a proposal by the Forum Nature Montreal. We can improve our relationship with biodiversity by learning something about the species. For example, we can learn the songs of birds, so you can then identify the species by what you hear. And we have this Greenway network in Montreal. Increasingly, you find some information if you go for walks. And we have done a study on that as part of an analysis of connectivity of natural areas as one indicator in the City Biodiversity Index. I don't have enough time to explain all of this, but I would love to invite you to look at it, in particular in this context, because we have done our study mostly about Meadowbrook and surroundings, and it's very close to the Lachine-Est development site. So we have a future potential scenario here, and you see they are neighbors, and it would be important to consider the role of this area in the wider context of the Greenway network. And this increased biodiversity awareness then will also imply a certain responsibility for protecting biodiversity, for understanding their needs well enough to be able to protect them appropriately. And with this, I want to come to a close here. And I want to recommend David Quammen's new book to you. I want to also mention, for example, for insects, that appropriate protection would need that we stop destroying them. We benefit from their pollination services, for example, but we also apply a lot of pesticides that have greatly reduced their numbers, and we are continuing to do so still today, including inside cities just for beautiful lawns. A strong example is shown in this documentary, the Nicole Brunsma story. I would highly recommend it because it shows what responsibility means of citizens, ordinary citizens who make a difference. The focus in this documentary is mostly on human health, but it's relevant for diversity as well. So first, I suggest we should strengthen and enhance our relationship with biodiversity. Second, we should consider the role of Lachine-Est within the surrounding Greenway network. And then third, create natural habitats that do not need any pesticides for maintenance. And I would like to stop here.
Thanks a lot, Jochen. I see that urban sprawl is kind of a huge issue. I think in many of the big cities, and especially I think as well in North American cities, this kind of American dream of going in the nature and commuting to the city center, this creating of single-use areas, I think this will be a huge question now, how this might continue after COVID-19. So I think this paper you showed was most probably before COVID-19. But is it to observe certain tendencies? Can you say something like this? Is it like to observe more in Canada than in the US, or like is it? Can you say something about this?
Absolutely. If I can may share my screen again, because then so which one is this now? See this? Oh, this one. Just a second. Because it's part of this City Biodiversity Index, which is exactly about monitoring. So are cities doing better or worse over time? And it has been proposed only recently, including 23 indicators. It's being revised right now, so a few more indicators have been added, exactly for making cities more aware of what is actually going on. So if you care about a topic or care about people, when you see them, you ask, how are you? And this is a way of asking biodiversity, how are you? And of course, they don't talk back to us. We have to look at them. We have to monitor them to find out how are they doing. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? And that's where I think this tool of an indicator for monitoring how biodiversity is doing is wonderful.
I want to make a comment. I like this idea of the indicator, and I mean the question is how we can make these demands more binding. I mean, to new developments. I mean, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Lachine-Est project that we're going to work on this summer. And actually, by the way, this evening at 7, there's a presentation on the concept for the Lachine development, where everybody can still register. The mayor and many others will present the ideas. So I think the charters are around, and I think we would know where to go. The question is why it doesn't happen. And I mean, maybe it's a bit of a provocative statement. I mean, that we now talk about ecosystem service and even pollination services. I mean, it's also capitalist. I mean, we just monitorize everything. And I mean, I wonder whether there's not another way of citizens agreeing to go towards more sort of higher or different biodiversity indicator without trying to put money tickets on everything. So I know that's probably the way of life in a Western society, but it's somehow we seem to always give in to quantifying everything because that's the only way probably things are moving. But maybe these, maybe these indicators could help. Saying apart from cost, we also need to fulfill a certain set of other indicators to just as why can't the city decide on a charter like you mentioned and say this is binding and you're not allowed to do development below an indicator of 55 or whatever the number then is, and that maybe would be a bit of a way out of this constant monitoring of the poor bees that get paid probably for every pollination that they do.
I agree. I think Kali wanted to say something, right?
Oh yeah, so Joken's laughing at me because I could talk for like 10 hours just about ecosystem services and the different indicators. I think one thing to keep in mind is that it's not necessarily just about monetization. I think there's a misconception that when we use a term like ecosystem services, that automatically implies a dollar value, and that's not necessarily true. You know, there are lots of people working on this concept, thinking about relational values, how people relate to biodiversity, why they value it, other ways of indicating you know, I've been working on ecosystem services for a decade. I've never put a dollar value on anything in any of my work. And that's something that's part of the reason why I think there's kind of a shifting terminology around this too, where we say things like nature-based solutions or nature's contributions to people, where we can think about how are these helping, you know, reduce the impacts of climate change or cooling the air or increasing our lifespan, which are, it's still human-centric. It's still focusing on how does this help us, but you don't necessarily need to put a dollar value on something to recognize that it is valuable. But I also think where this originally came from is that our kind of classic conservation methods of saying, hey, this is important, we want to protect this, they didn't work in all cases. There were a lot of people who you would say, we need more biodiversity, this is important, this is wonderful, and they would say, I don't care. And if you can say, well, look, it's going to improve the value of your home, or it's going to reduce this bill, or it's going to have this impact on the healthcare system, then you get people to listen who wouldn't listen. And so I think it's about having a portfolio of approaches. You want the approach to say, here's an ecosystem service, here's a way that this benefits me. You also want to say, look how wonderful and magical and beautiful this biodiversity is. Listen to this bird song, look at this bee, and kind of connect with people on that.
Okay, I want to put the question from an online attendee. I'm curious how we might think about building relationship between the local biodiversity and immigrants, or even newcomers from different regions of Canada, for whom the local plants, animals, and other features of the ecosystems are quite foreign, and who maybe long for the familiarity of the ecosystems back home. And I think this is a question I can forward to Rebecca.
You're muted, Rebecca. No.
For me now?
Yes.
Okay. If somebody else can take it, then I will work out technical difficulties. Now?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Okay, I think this is an issue not just for new immigrants, but for most people who live here who don't know very much about the non-human beings that surround them. There are lots of resources available online, and now during the pandemic is a particularly wonderful time to use them. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has an All About Birds site, which will teach people, you know, from children through to the elderly about different bird songs, about how to identify birds. There are the Espace pour la Vie sites, espacepourlavie.ca, that has a lot of information about native plants, and the KBO sites through which people can identify the trees growing outside their homes. All of these sites are useful, and many more are useful for people who live here now. But I think also we have a responsibility in our classe d'accueil, as well as in our regular school system, to teach students, whether they are new immigrants or not, to teach people about our local diversity. And that doing so will make all of us feel more like we belong, feel more part of this ecosystem, rather than just living in a human system to which it might not always be as easy to belong. Also, you know, no matter where you come from in the world, there are species here that are related to the species that you have at home. So those who are really missing home can find corollaries here as well. I remember being in Europe as a student and missing home and finding the great tits that were similar in bird species that were similar to the chickadees that we have here, and finding some comfort in that.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. I think since time is running,
Can I make one really quick comment on that, Michael?
Yes, go for it.
So one thing, I think Rebecca is absolutely right that a lot of this is education. But your question also reminded me of a program. So I lived briefly in Newfoundland, and they had a program there that I absolutely loved through one of the nature organizations, where they would train people from, you know, diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures about the local biodiversity. And those people would give tours in different languages. And so they would have tours specifically geared towards new immigrants, new Canadians in Arabic, in Farsi, in French, in Spanish, in all of these languages. And this would give people a chance to connect with people from their cultures and learn something about the new place that they lived. And so I think connecting through language and through shared communities and making this something that you find a friend who shares a cultural background and you go learn your bird songs together. You know, this doesn't need to be organized, but having some kind of cultural connection or touchstone to a familiar home and then learning about something new.
Thank you so much, Carly. And I think now it's turn of Rebecca. She was explaining already a lot. So Rebecca Titler is coordinator of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability. And in addition, she's part-time faculty member in the Department of Biology. Her research concentrates on the interactions between biodiversity, the structure of forested landscapes and people, both in a larger forest context and in an urban and peri-urban context. The title of her presentation is The Importance of Biodiversity in Urban Systems. And I need to find a way to, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me now? Yes, okay, great. I'm just having some issues with my microphone here. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I should say that I also teach at the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability, and I see some of my students here in the audience. So for you guys, some of this may look familiar. Michael and Ursa approached me and asked me to speak about the relationship between biodiversity and well-being. So that is what I am doing. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Share. If I put that on slideshow, does that work? Yes? Okay, perfect. So as Carly discussed, I'll be fairly brief here because Carly and Jochen have already covered a lot of the important points. I think there's one important point that I want to stress, and that is about the importance of diversity in biodiversity. We've seen how access to green space is important for our health and well-being. Carly spoke about that a little bit. There are studies, for example, that find that patients in the hospital who can see green space outside of their windows have better outcomes, faster recovery times than those who can't. This is the Royal Vic Hospital in Montreal with its beautiful views of the mountain, and you can see the mountains in Vermont from some of these higher rooms up here. We know that it's very important that the recreational opportunities that are provided by green spaces are very important. So this is the Meadowbrook Golf Course here. This is along the Lachine Canal. So we know that green space is important, and Carly has talked about heat islands and how trees are important. So we know that these are important for our health and our well-being. And we know that diversity matters in ecological systems and in social ecological systems. These are just a few examples here of what I would call social ecological systems because they involve benefiting people. Here we have one of our native bumblebees here who's pollinating an apple tree. Pollinators have been found to be more effective and more efficient when they are provided with a diversity of plant foods rather than simply one type of plant food. We see, for example, that in almond farms in the United States, where they have kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of almond trees that bloom for a very brief period of time, pollinators do well for that brief period of time, but then will starve to death when that resource is gone. So we know the importance of providing a diversity of food types. We also, there's a study by Robin Naidoo that was published a few years ago, my students have read it, that looks at how a diversity of habitats actually actually means that bees as pollinators will pollinate more flowers, simply because if there is a greater diversity of vegetation, then there is also a greater diversity of other insects and birds in the area. And certain other insects and birds, if they come close to a plant that is being pollinated or that is being visited by a bee, the bee will move more often if there is more threat, or if they perceive competition from other insects and birds who are approaching, so that the bees will actually visit more flowers and be more efficient pollinators when there is a greater diversity of habitats and therefore a greater diversity of other insects and animals in the area. At the top right here, we have a picture of a mixed species plantation. There is more and more emerging literature on comparing single species plantations to mixed species plantations, and finding that mixed species plantations can actually produce more biomass and store more carbon than single species plantations. If you want to visit a great mixed species plantation, there is a very small experimental plantation out on the way to the Morgan Arboretum out in St. Anne. So my geography students go out there every year. We're also finding that in agricultural systems, perhaps we are rediscovering that in agricultural systems, planting a diversity of crops together can often result in the production of more calories in terms of food. So this is a Three Sisters garden, which our ancestors knew was a good idea, but some large agricultural companies may have forgotten. So we know that diversity matters in these types of systems. The more species we have, the more kinds of different organisms we have, the more productive these systems are. We also know that diversity leads to greater resistance and resilience in social ecological systems and also in ecological systems. And I'll use a local example here about street trees. We are seeing this summer that the city is cutting down a lot of trees. They're cutting down 40,000 ash trees that have been affected by the invasive emerald ash borer. And the result of this varies depending on the neighborhood. So the result of losing this many trees on the scale of the city is obviously horrific. If you live on a street that has one tree, one ash tree, and a diversity of other trees, you are sad to lose that ash tree, but you still maintain the services and the benefits, those heat attenuation benefits, for example, all of those benefits from having trees that are not affected by the emerald ash borer because they're not ash trees. However, if you live on a street that is all ash, and if you want, you can visit near the Loyola campus. Patricia Avenue, which is just a few blocks over from campus, has been struck by the emerald ash borer, and they are struggling to maintain their trees. You may go very quickly from a tree-lined street to a street with no trees at all. Something like this, which is near Toronto in Ontario, where we see these lovely ash trees, and then we see after the ash borer has come through that there is nothing left. So a system that has a lack of diversity here in terms of street trees, or a lack of diversity in the species that are planted, is likely to be more catastrophically struck by a disaster than one that has a diversity. So we know diversity matters for social ecological systems and for ecological systems, and we know biodiversity matters for people in general. But does the diversity part of biodiversity matter for human well-being? This was the question that was put to me by Michael and Ursula. So to address it, we first have to talk about what we mean by well-being. Carly has defined biodiversity. Thank you, Carly. I should say that when I looked for pictures on human well-being on the internet, every single picture that I found was of people outside. However, that's not in the definition. The definition of well-being is there is a big discussion in social sciences and in the health sciences about the definition of well-being. But it generally includes, the CDC uses these words, saying that it includes the presence of positive emotions and moods, the absence of negative emotions, general satisfaction with life, fulfillment, and positive functioning. This is a feeling. I think well-being is something that we all have an idea what it means, even if we can't if we can't define it. We know when we're feeling well versus when we're feeling stressed or depressed or unhealthy. So there are actually not a huge number of studies in the literature on associations between the actual diversity part of biodiversity and human well-being, but there are a few that my students have read. And, here's one published by Richard Fuller and colleagues in 2007. And what these researchers did is they studied parks in England, in Sheffield, England. They quantified they counted the number of species. They quantified the biodiversity in terms of tree species, butterfly species, and bird species in various parks. And then they interviewed people about how they were feeling in these parks. And through this study, they were able to examine correlations between human well-being, how humans were feeling, and how diverse the system in which they were found was. And what they found was that they found measurable positive associations between species richness of urban green space and the well-being of people who were visiting these green spaces. Now, I have to say they didn't find much of an effect for butterflies. They did find that people can't tell the difference between species of butterflies, so they didn't really notice whether a park had more butterfly species or fewer butterfly species. They were more likely to notice differences in bird species, and so the diversity of bird species did increase the well-being of people visiting these parks. And they were most likely to notice diversity in terms of plant species. So there was the highest correlation here, a positive correlation between the diversity of plants in the park and the well-being of those who were in the park. I'm going to talk about one more study quickly that is more recent. This is a 2018 study that looks at older citizens, so 75 to 90-year-olds. They surveyed 75 to 90-year-old people who were living in their own homes, so independently living, and then they looked at the diversity of habitat types, of natural land cover types within half a kilometer radius of their homes. So natural land cover types might be coniferous forest versus a mixed forest versus a deciduous forest versus a wetland versus a lake. And what they found was really interesting. They found that basic quality of life, as identified based on WHO indicators and interviews, among older people was positively correlated with the diversity of natural space within half a kilometer of their homes. And this was controlling for physical activity. So when I first read this, I thought, well, it's probably just because people who live in more diverse areas are getting out more, and that's where the correlation is. But it's not. They controlled for physical activity, and they still find this positive effect of having a diversity of natural systems on how people are living. So I think if we think about this kind of as just humans and not as researchers, the correlation is fairly obvious, perhaps. If you're interested in insects, it's much more interesting to look at a diversity of insects and to keep seeing the same insect over and over again. This is a picture of the Lachine Canal here, which has a nice diversity of vegetative structure, and that's part of what makes it an aesthetically pleasing image. Here, this is a girl who's bird watching, and anyone who's interested in birds, it's much more interesting to pay attention to the birds and to watch the birds if there is a diversity of birds to look at. This is a fall picture of Montreal, and you can see part of what makes this picture so beautiful is the diversity of vegetation in this picture. So I think intuitively we understand that it's not just green space that's important, but that it is the diversity of green space, the diversity of non-human living organisms around us that affects us in a positive way. So moving forward in terms of planning urban spaces, I would say we should plan for as much green space as possible. parks, access for everyone, green roofs, whatever combination is possible, but also be sure to plan for a diversity of green spaces to maximize the health and well-being of all. And for all of you individually, this is a great time, I've already said it, to learn about local diversity to foster your own well-being. And I think this is something we are feeling, especially right now, the need to take care of ourselves physically and at least as much emotionally and psychologically. And we're all, you know, people are going outside much more, and really understanding that that connection with the outside world is important to our well-being. So I've given, these are some of the sites that I mentioned earlier. I'll leave them here in the slides, just a few sites that are easily accessible and great places to start learning about your local biodiversity, to take care of yourself. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. We have immediately a question from the audience, very emotional, I have the feeling. Will the trees get replaced? If so, by what? Are there plans to mix?
Yes, so hang on.
Trees?
I'm just going to unshare my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Stop sharing screen. Okay, there we go. Did I succeed in stopping sharing my screen? Okay, yes, so the city is working hard to replace trees, and if you do happen to be on the Loyola campus and visit Patricia Avenue, you will notice that they've been planting a diversity of young trees to replace the trees that have been lost. But and there are great tree planting projects across the city right now that organizations like Soverdi which is a nonprofit organization whose mandate is to plant as many trees as possible in the city of Montreal. We are increasing the number of trees in general in Montreal, but we do need to keep planting. We also have to keep in mind, however, that the trees that we plant now will not be large trees for quite a while, and we have to keep planting over the coming years on a regular basis, so that we maintain not just a diversity of species of trees, but also a diversity of ages of trees. Because if we plant all our trees right now, and then they are all, 50 years old in 50 years and 70 years old in 70 years, they are all aging and dying around the same time. A little bit of a variation depending on the species, but in general, we would need to be sure to maintain a diversity of age classes as well as a diversity of species of trees. I think the city of Montreal is doing better right now than they have in the past.
Okay, I think
I can
yes, exactly.
speak to the serviceberry part of the question.
I didn't catch that part.
No, I think Rebecca's answer was spot on. The city is working really hard to try and replace these. If you Google replacing an ash tree Montreal, you'll find the link to, what do I do if I have an ash tree and I want to replace it? And there is kind of an approved list of species that you can go through and look at. And serviceberries or Amelanchier would generally not be something they'd use to replace an ash, because serviceberries are quite small. And often if you're replacing an ash as a street tree, they want a tree that's taller, that's going to be above 9 meters, so it gets kind of similar benefits in terms of shading and carbon and pollution. But certainly you can plant serviceberries in your yard. They're wonderful trees. We have planted several on campus in the tree planting that Rebecca I think mentioned. And so if you have a special love of serviceberries, go to Loyola campus. There are some brand new ones there.
Yeah, I'll have to add the serviceberries on campus are blooming right now, so it's an especially nice time to go. We planted serviceberries on campus because they provide food for people, for birds, for pollinators. We planted them particularly around the gardens because of that, but also because they're native species. And if you are looking to replace an ash that's in front of your house, you should have some input as to what is planted there. So think about requesting some species that are native rather than non-native, because in protecting our native species, we are protecting global biodiversity.
I have one question, as I'm not familiar with the planning processes here, how such a new plots or old plots gets developed. Is it like that the developers or someone has to prove as well a concept for biodiversity or like green space planning or something like this? Is there something like this that needs to get approved? Or will this come? Because I mean, this is now just if we reference now what we can learn from all this, what all three of you said now. Is there some kind of regulation possibility that can influence and push such a development? Do you see something like this? Maybe Jochen from the from the Department of Urban Planning? No? Okay.
Maybe Ursula, I was going to say maybe Ursula knows something about developers, but as far as I'm aware, there are not specific biodiversity requirements. There are certainly some bylaws around, you know, whether you can cut down trees or, you know, trees needing to replace them, but I really don't think there's anything in terms of the diversity, you know, diversity of species or planting particular types of species.
No.
Even a list of best practices would be wonderful.
I think, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but I heard in the Lachine project discussion, there's for sure a percentage of green space that needs to be provided on a site. And I think that that's part of the zoning process. I think there's a minimum number, but it can be negotiated up. So what I remember was that there's a minimum of 10% of public park sort of requirements. But it's a good question. So we should maybe, that could be asked tonight in the proposal, in the first sort of real public presentation of the Lachine project, of how much green space they actually put forward.
And I think, you know, Rebecca's presentation raised a really important point that there is a difference between just green space and biodiverse space, and it's, you know, having a number of a target for the amount of green space is great, but thinking about what we plant there. And I think often, you know, we leave these decisions to developers or to landscape architects or planners who maybe don't have training in biology or ecology. And so these trees or species that we're planting, we could be planting native species, but that step is missing. And so more discussion of, you know, what are you going to plant? Are you planting not only different species, but things that are different sizes or different shapes or different in some way or native to the region that will support our native wildlife?
I have one question from the web audience. Are there big arguments in this field about how to accurately measure biodiversity? And if so, what do people disagree about? Are there experiences?
We could probably all answer this. I'll be quick and then I'll let Jochen and Rebecca. I don't know about big arguments, but there are certainly many different ways we can measure biodiversity. You know, the most common way, because it's straightforward, is we count the number of species. But we can also think about what functions those species have. So if you're looking at trees, if you have 3 tree species, but they're all very similar and they're the same size and the same shape and the same kind of fruits, is that more diverse than if you had 3 very different trees? You can look at the relatedness of the species. So there's certainly lots of different ways to do it. And there are arguments maybe about which measures we should use for which outcomes or which projects. So it really depends on your goals.
Yeah, I think I would just add very quickly to that one of the other issues, I mean, I think we count species because it's easy to do. Often that's the easiest thing to do, so that's what we do. But there are some measures involve things like like a discussion of evenness. So looking not just at how many species, but how evenly distributed they are, not in terms of how spatially evenly distributed they are, but how well represented are the different species. So if you have 10 trees and they are 2 different species, but only one of them is a different species and the other 9 are the same species, you have low evenness. Whereas if you have 2 species of trees and they are half of the trees that you have are one species and half of the other, then you have higher evenness. We can think of it in terms of humans as well. If you have a room with one person of Asian descent and everybody else is Caucasian, that's not a very diverse room. Whereas if you have a greater evenness, then we would consider that to be a higher diversity.
And I wonder to what extent the biodiversity kind of discussion is going. Like, can we have everywhere beehives? Can we have like everywhere like urban farming? I mean, at a certain moment, it's like, is someone aware of what happens? Because I think if everyone starts as a hype to have now some bees on the balcony, maybe because of bad neighbors or something like this, then like it will influence each other as well. I mean, is this negotiable, or is there, I mean, is there someone looking for it at all? Coming back again to this topic, sorry.
I will speak to bees, and I think my student Serena is probably watching, and I wish I could like pull her into the screen to speak for me. But so something that many people don't realize, Montreal has over 150 species of bees just in the city. There are lots of bees. Honeybees that are in hives that we manage are not native to Montreal, and they're a livestock species, right? We manage them to get an agricultural product. And there are benefits to that. You know, we connect with nature, we have honey to eat, but in terms of biodiversity, to say you're going to get a beehive to save the bees is kind of like saying I'm going to get a chicken coop to save the birds. And you would never do that, right? I wouldn't say I love birds, I care about birds, so I got some backyard chickens and I'm doing my part to save the birds. But that's what we do when we take beehives and we say that we are saving bee diversity. And I think that's something that has not been very well communicated. There is a lot of kind of rhetoric and particular maybe companies that say, oh, you know, do your part, be sustainable, have a beehive. And in terms of, you know, can we still have hives in the city? How many? That's something we are trying to figure out. So there's a postdoctoral researcher in my lab right now, Dr. Gail McInnes, who works here at Concordia, who is doing a big study this summer in Montreal to look at bee diversity and see how the density of honeybee hives might be affecting our native bee populations. And the idea is not to say we can't have any beehives, but it's to find a balance, to say, okay, let's make sure we don't have too many so that we can still have our native bees, to make sure we have enough resources for both. And so I do think that we need 2 things. We need education. I think people want to do the right thing, and they don't necessarily know what the right thing is in terms of helping biodiversity. And then we need guidelines or regulations for how many of these things we can have. And if you want to help the bees, some of the best things that you can do are doing less, being a little lazier. You know, you need to buy anything. Mow your lawn a little less often. Leave some bare patches of soil where they can make their nests, you know, in the ground. By being a little bit lazier with our yard work, we can support, you know, Jochen mentioned lawns and pesticides. Let the dandelions bloom, let some weeds grow, you know, let go of that need to have this really perfect yard, and we can actually make space for other species around us.
Maybe this is the point I can mention skunks. Like, just arriving here, and 2 weeks later we had a fantastic meeting with a skunk and our dog, and it was fantastic. So skunks in the city, maybe it's bridging to another topic of I heard a nice discussion about pathways of animals through the city, and I think this is a very interesting topic as well. as most of them, they will not just live around the next trash bin. I think this topic of regulation and to have a more closer look to what is really happening might be really interesting, and as we can influence it maybe with the Lachine-Est project, I guess we can address it, and this would be very nice. And I guess Rebecca wanted to still mention something.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on Carly's answer to that question. If we're thinking about urban agriculture as well, the same issue comes up. If you have too much shade, then you can't grow tomatoes. So we need to have a balance where we make space for urban agricultural projects, but also for green space uses that are not compatible with urban agriculture.
So I guess we need urban agriculture might be another session, as I think this is a very highly interesting concept, idea, whatever. It's a hype. I mean, it's not something new. It's ongoing since a longer time, and there are many companies out there, I think as well in Montreal, delivering and producing on industrial plants as well, something. And I think this is highly interesting as well for education to look in this topic. But
yeah, I think you could have an entire panel on urban agriculture, and we have some wonderful experts in Montreal who could speak to that. And there's a really rich discussion there, not only around the ecology and the biodiversity, but the social, justice and equity and food security aspects of urban agriculture. I would attend your discussion if you have one, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's close related, both topics like food and biodiversity and education and urban planning. I learned from today a lot that it means like there needs to be some thoughts about, and not only new districts, as well to connect it to other districts. Maybe some last comments from everyone. Just what you think in a 1 or 2 sentences, what you would recommend a new to plan district, what you want to tell them, like what is interesting, what they should consider, if you should just give them something on the way for 2-3 sentences. Maybe we start, Carly.
Sure, so 2 or 3 sentences for a new district or a new development. I would say don't underestimate the power of trees. Trees, and this is an obvious thing I would say, but trees provide so many benefits, across the board. You don't need a huge amount of green space to integrate them, right? And so think about your urban forest and make sure that it is diverse from the start. Don't plant your same species of tree along your entire street, because then when the next emerald ash borer hits, those trees are gone. So I would say, yeah, make space for trees. I think my 1 sentence advice on almost anything urban ecology is more trees, less pavement.
Thanks a lot. Maybe I hand over to Rebecca.
Oh, Carly kind of took the words right out of my mouth, but I think I would add a consideration for what is already there. So in terms of human and non-human inhabitants, it's important to think about what the consequences that a new development will have for people who live there already or who live nearby. We want to make sure that we are not leading to gentrification, that we're not driving out people who have been in the neighborhood for a long time. In the same way, we want to make sure that we are taking into account the biodiversity, non-human biodiversity that might already be there. So in terms of trees, for example, if we can plan to maintain the trees that are already there rather than cutting them down to plant new ones, we will start with a system that already has some diversity in terms of the age structure of some of the vegetation in the area. We should be considering the animals as well that are in the area, and the ecological as well as the social and economic function of a new development.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. handing over to Jochen.
Muted.
You're muted, Jochen.
Yes, yes,
Thank you.
I will try to share one more slide, perhaps. Let me see to summarize this. So I hope this works. I would like to encourage everybody to think about the context, like also in an ecological sense. How does the neighborhood you're working on relate to its environment? And there are other parks around there, other green spaces. There is a lot of potential to restore connections, and that would be nice to consider here. So what's the role within the larger context?
Okay.
Thanks a lot, I guess. Yeah, I give to Ursula last word.
Well, thanks everybody for participating in this discussion. I think we went quite a way from the sort of broad picture of next generation cities, where we want to transform our cities towards zero carbon, livable, healthy, ecological environments. And I think we clarified quite a few topics. I mean, from the sort of need of having, of considering urban green spaces as just a critical infrastructure than the other infrastructures that we have in the built environment. I think that's pretty important. And then Jochen brought up this, the issue of mindfulness, awareness of our natural environment. I mean, which is crucial, but on the other hand, also the indicators, the biodiversity indicators and charters, which go in a way of what we could recommend, maybe as a more binding framework for new developments. I think that's something we should be pursuing and pushing, because there doesn't seem to be much disagreement of how these indicators are defined. So I think there might obviously be different ways of weighing the many different factors that go into this biodiversity indicator, but I think more or less you all seem to agree that it's measurable and you know what's good for biodiversity and for the diversity aspect of it as well. So that just now these very simple rules of saying 10% of a development needs to be green is a bit simplistic, because there should be probably more specification in there of what that means, what kind of species, what a variation of species. So I think that's something really to continue to work on. I mean, how we could integrate these sort of biodiversity indicators as in a tool set for urban planning. And that should be discussed with the city and with new developments. I think that's a really interesting outcome of this lively afternoon discussion. So thank you all for joining. I think we will follow up on this topic related to urban farming, and as we know, everything is related to everything else, so that I think biodiversity will be with us even in transportation planning and other topics that we're going to address in the future. So thank you all for joining, and I hand back to Anna.
Thanks very much, Ursula. Thank you, everybody, for your considered, engaging insights and recommendations, really, for urban well-being. And thanks to all of you for attending on Facebook and on this webinar. We really invite you to keep attending the sessions that we are working hard to produce on a weekly basis by checking us out on social media at CU Fourth Space, or just looking on our website at concordia.ca/4. to find out about further virtual conversations, workshops, and other fun activities that we'll be hosting throughout the summer. Probably some of these folks here you'll see again, because they have so much to share. So we really appreciate your time, your energy. We wish you a beautiful rest of the evening. Get outside, go have fun, and we look forward to engaging with you all again. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and have a very nice evening. It was a pleasure to discuss and to hear all these things, and hope to see you soon live for sure in Zooms very soon again, and take care. Bye.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It was nice to see you all.
Yeah.
Hi, Doug. Nice to see you.
Doug, nice to see you.
Yeah, now we see him as well.
And
Yeah,
thanks a
thanks.
lot, Doug. Thank you so much.
Mhm. Oh, good.
Good.